Let's talk about breathing. You think you understand it, right? I mean, you're doing it right now without even thinking about it. You've been doing it more than 20,000 times every day. It happens when you're awake, when you're asleep, when you're completely unaware. So you must understand it, right? Okay, then try explaining it to me. Exactly what is happening when you inhale. Where does that air go? And what in it actually keeps you alive? Most people will say something vague. You breathe in oxygen. The lungs absorb it. The body uses it. But those answers really don't explain anything at all. They just name a process you've never actually seen. So let's look at it. Right now, the air you just inhaled contains about 21% oxygen. And with each breath at rest, you bring in about 500 milliliters of air. Those oxygen molecules pass through your nose, where they are warmed, filtered, and humidified without you even knowing it. They travel down your trachea, branching into smaller and smaller airways until they reach about 300 million alveoli in your lungs, a network with a surface area nearly the size of a tennis court. And then something remarkable happens. A thin membrane only about 0.5 micrometers thick thin enough to be almost non-existent allows that molecule to cross from the air into the blood based solely on a pressure difference. No hand pushes it. No will controls it. Just physics. In your blood, hemoglobin A molecule decoded by Max Perutz in 1960 grabs that oxygen and carries it throughout your body. And within 5 to 10 seconds, the very molecule you just inhaled may have already reached your brain. From its perspective, there is no story at all, only physical laws operating with precision. But from your perspective, this is where everything begins. Every thought, every movement, every emotion you experience starts from a chain of reactions triggered by a breath you've never truly understood. You might think that the oxygen molecule just enters the blood and then gets used by the body, but that's still far too vague, almost meaningless. It's like saying electricity creates light without understanding what's really happening behind the switch. What actually happens goes much deeper, at a level you can't see, but that determines all the energy of your life. That oxygen molecule enters inside the cell, and more specifically, into a tiny structure called the mitochondrion, where a process takes place that, if you understand it, will make you start seeing your body in a completely different way. Here, oxygen participates in the electron transport chain, a mechanism proposed by Peter Mitchell in 1961. His idea at the time was considered too simple to explain a system as complex as life, but it turned out that this very simplicity was the key. Oxygen does not directly create energy. It serves as the final electron acceptor in a chain of reactions. Electrons, stripped from glucose and other fuel molecules, are pushed through a chain of proteins located in the mitochondrial membrane. As they move, the energy doesn't disappear. It is converted into a proton gradient, an electrochemical difference between the two sides of the membrane. You can imagine it like water being dammed up behind a dam. And then, when protons flow back through an enzyme called ATP synthase, that energy is used to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency that every cell in your body uses. If you stop and think about this, you'll realize that inside you there are trillions of machines working continuously, without stopping, to produce what you simply call energy. But here's the part that most people never truly understand. You don't store ATP. You don't have an energy warehouse to draw from. Your body has to produce ATP continuously, every second, every moment. An adult can regenerate. When oxygen is insufficient, the cell is forced to switch to a less efficient pathway, producing lactate. This is what you feel when your muscles start to burn, feel heavy, and lose strength during exercise. But that is not a vague sensation. It is a sign that your energy system is being limited by a lack of oxygen. Your body at rest consumes about 250 milliliters of oxygen per minute. When you exercise, this number can increase many times over. And what is remarkable is that your brain, although it makes up only about 2% of your body weight, consumes about 20% of that oxygen. This shows that the brain is an extremely expensive organ in terms of energy. Every thought, every memory, Every decision costs ATP, and that ATP depends directly on oxygen. If the oxygen supply is interrupted for about 3 to 5 minutes, brain cells begin to die in a way that cannot be reversed. This is not theory. This is the physical limit of the system you are living in. Now let's go back to something you may have said before. I feel like I have no energy. You think that's a psychological state. You think it's due to lack of sleep, stress, or work. But at a deeper level, what you're describing may be a completely physical problem. The energy you feel every day is not an abstract concept. It is the result of your body's ability to bring oxygen in, transport it, and use it efficiently inside the mitochondria. If any part of this chain is not working well, your entire system will feel it. You feel more tired, think more slowly, react more poorly. Not because you are weak, but because your energy system is operating below capacity. And the most important thing is this: none of this starts in the brain. None of it starts in the muscles. It starts at a much more fundamental level. It starts with oxygen. And if you go back to the starting point, you will see something very simple, but impossible to ignore. All the energy you have, all the ability you have to experience life, depends on a chain of reactions triggered by a breath you almost never pay attention to. You may think the story is simply this: oxygen comes in, energy is produced, end of story. But no, that's only half the picture, and the other half is something most people completely misunderstand. Let's talk about carbon dioxide. You were taught that it is waste gas, something the body needs to get rid of, an unwanted byproduct of metabolism. It sounds reasonable, but the problem is that this understanding is not only incomplete, but also hides its real role. Carbon dioxide is not just something you breathe out. It is one of the most important factors controlling how you breathe in the first place. The respiratory center in your brain, located in the medulla oblongata, does not really care about oxygen the way you think. It reacts much more strongly to carbon dioxide. This was proven at the beginning of the 20th century through physiological experiments, when scientists realized that increasing carbon dioxide in the blood stimulates breathing far more strongly than decreasing oxygen. In other words, you don't breathe primarily because of a lack of oxygen. You breathe because carbon dioxide increases. And that changes the way you see the entire system. When carbon dioxide is produced in the cell, it diffuses into the blood and dissolves in the plasma. There, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid, a reaction catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic acid then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. It is this hydrogen ion that changes the pH of the blood, and this is an extremely important point. Your body maintains blood pH within a very narrow range, about 7.35 to 7.45. It may sound like a small detail, but in reality, it is one of the most tightly controlled things in physiology. If the pH deviates too far from this range, enzymes stop working effectively, proteins denature, and biological processes begin to break down. Even a small change can have major consequences. These sensations are often interpreted as psychological, but in reality they start from chemistry. You have changed the carbon dioxide balance, and your system is reacting. What's interesting is that in those moments, you may feel like you don't have enough air, as if you need to breathe deeper and faster. But the paradox is that you already have too much oxygen. The problem is not a lack of oxygen. The problem is a lack of carbon dioxide. And this sounds counterintuitive because you were taught that carbon dioxide is something that needs to be removed. But here, you begin to see that it is an indispensable part of the system. It is not just a byproduct. It is a signal. It is a control variable. It is what helps your body know when to breathe and how to breathe. If you disrupt that balance, you don't just change a number in the blood. You change the entire state of your nervous system, your circulation, and your body's perception. And this is the point where I want you to stop and think. In the previous part, we talked about oxygen as a source of energy. But if there is only oxygen without carbon dioxide at the right level, the system does not work properly. Oxygen needs carbon dioxide to be released efficiently from hemoglobin into the tissues, a phenomenon called the Bohr effect. That means, paradoxically, if carbon dioxide is too low, Even if oxygen is present in the blood, it cannot be used effectively in the cells. You can have oxygen, but you cannot use it properly. And if you connect all of this together, you begin to see a clearer picture, but one that is also much more complex than you once thought. Breathing is not just about bringing oxygen in and expelling carbon dioxide. It is a delicate balancing system between these two things. And the feeling you call not having enough air, the one that makes you breathe deeper and faster, is often not a sign of oxygen deficiency, but a sign of carbon dioxide imbalance. This means you may be reacting incorrectly to your body's signals, making the problem worse instead of solving it. And if you go back to the beginning, you will see that the chain of reactions we talked about does not depend only on whether you are breathing or not, but on how you breathe, the speed at which you breathe, and how your body handles carbon dioxide. Once again, everything comes back to a simple action you have done your whole life, but have never truly understood. So who, or more precisely what, is listening to that signal and deciding how you will breathe? You may think that you are the one controlling your breathing, that you can inhale deeply, exhale, or hold your breath whenever you want, and that is true to a certain extent. But if you really observe, you will realize that most of the time you are not controlling it at all. It is happening without your participation. And that brings us to a small but extremely important structure in your brain, the medulla oblongata. This is where the respiratory center is located, a system of automatic nerves that works continuously to maintain your life without you almost ever being aware of it. It does not ask for your opinion. It does not wait for you to make a decision. It just works. Inside that system, there are chemical receptors called chemoreceptors that continuously measure the concentration of carbon dioxide and pH in your blood in real time. When carbon dioxide rises, pH drops. These receptors send signals to the respiratory center to increase the breathing rate. When carbon dioxide decreases, the signals change and the breathing rate is adjusted again. All of this happens continuously, every second, with a precision that, if you tried to control it consciously, you would fail almost immediately. What is remarkable is that this system does not need you to be awake to function. It continues when you are asleep, when you are unconscious, even in situations where your consciousness has completely disappeared. That is why you can sleep through the night without having to and that creates a very rare bridge between your autonomic nervous system and your consciousness. In other words, breathing is one of the few functions in the body where you are both the observer and can become the controller. But it is important to understand that when you intervene in the system, you do not turn off the automatic system. You are only interacting with it. If you try to hold your breath for too long, soar encore will rise to the point where the signals from the chemoreceptors become too strong, and eventually the automatic system will override your will. You will be forced to breathe. This shows that the system does not just exist, but that it has higher priority than your consciousness when it comes to survival. But in the space between completely automatic and completely conscious, there is a zone where you can influence how the system operates. You can slow down your breathing, and that will change Sochon, Walopaka levels, change pH, and thereby change the state of your nervous system. You can breathe faster and create an entirely different chain of reactions. This means that although you did not design this system, you can adjust the way it works in real time. And if you connect this to what we talked about in the previous part, you begin to see a clearer picture. Clock is not just a signal. The respiratory center is not just a controller. And you are not just a passive participant in this system. You are living in a two-way control system where one part of you operates according to automatic biological laws, and another part can intervene, adjust, and even redirect that system. And this leads to an interesting question. If you can intervene in such an important automatic system, what exactly are you changing when you change the way you breathe? If you accept that you can intervene in the automatic respiratory system, then the next thing you need to understand is this. Every time you change the way you breathe, you are not just moving air. You are sending direct signals into your nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, which controls responses you don't need to think about, such as heart rate, digestion, or blood pressure, is divided into two main branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic. One is responsible for the activated state, what you often call fight or flight, the fight or flight response. The other is responsible for the recovery, rest, and repair state, often called rest and digest. These two systems do not operate independently. They continuously adjust each other like two ends of a lever, and the position of that lever determines your physiological and emotional state at any given moment. When you breathe fast and shallow, especially through the mouth, you are sending a very specific signal to the nervous system. Something is wrong. Increased breathing rate is one of the oldest physiological signs of danger. As a result, the sympathetic system is activated. Heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, cortisol and adrenaline are released. Blood is redirected to the muscles, and your body prepares for action. This is extremely useful if you are running from a real threat. But if it happens while you are sitting in front of a screen, in a meeting, or lying in bed trying to sleep, then the system is operating out of context. Conversely, when you slow your breathing down, especially when you lengthen the exhale, you activate an entirely different system. The vagus nerve, one of the longest and most important nerves in the body, plays a central role in this. When activated, it slows the heart rate, lowers blood pressure, and sends signals that the body is safe. You begin to feel calmer, more stable, and recovery processes start to be prioritized. This is not a vague psychological effect. This is physiology. Stephen Porges has described the role of the vagus nerve in regular. When you change your breathing rhythm, you are changing the input signal to this system. You are telling your body that everything is okay, or there is danger, and your body believes that signal, even when it comes from you yourself. This creates a feedback loop that most people do not realize. Your emotions affect the way you breathe, but the way you breathe also affects your emotions in return. If you are anxious, you breathe faster. But if you start breathing faster, you can also create a feeling of anxiety. Conversely, if you deliberately slow your breathing, you can reduce the level of activation of the nervous system, even if the source of stress is still there. This does not mean you are tricking your body. It means you are using a mechanism that actually exists in the system. And when you put all of this together, you begin to see that breathing is not just a basic biological function. It is a control interface, a tool you can use to adjust your own state in real time, not by thinking about being calm, but by changing a specific physical variable that your nervous system responds to immediately. This leads us to a conclusion that most of the time you are not just breathing, you are breathing wrong. Not wrong in a moral or overly technical sense, but wrong in a physiological sense, in a way that distorts the system you depend on to maintain a stable state. Chronic stress, which many people view as a normal part of modern life, does not exist only in your thoughts. It manifests very clearly in the way you breathe. When you are in a state of prolonged tension, your body gradually shifts from deep, slow, diaphragmatic breathing to shallow, rapid breathing, mainly in the upper chest. This may initially be just a temporary response, but when it repeats long enough, it becomes the default. You no longer choose that breathing pattern. You live inside it. And this is where the loop begins to form. You are stressed, so you breathe faster. When you breathe faster, you expel more conicorn, lowering the concentration of conicorn in the blood, changing the pH, and triggering the physiological responses we have already discussed, a faster heartbeat. Feelings of restlessness, dizziness, and difficulty concentrating. These sensations are then interpreted by you as anxiety or instability, and that in turn makes you breathe even faster. A closed loop, no natural stopping point. This phenomenon is not new. In medicine, it has been described since the 1930s under the name hyperventilation syndrome. Doctors realized that many patients came in with symptoms such as palpitations, tingling in the hands, shortness of breath, mild chest pain, or even a feeling of impending fainting, but with no clear heart or lung damage. The problem lay in the way they were breathing. They were breathing more than the actual metabolic needs of their bodies required. And the paradox is that they often felt as though they were short of air. This led them to breathe even faster, making the condition worse. If you look closely, you will see that this is not uncommon in modern life. People working in high-pressure environments, people who frequently feel anxious, People who spend a lot of time in front of screens with little physical activity often tend to breathe shallowly and rapidly without realizing it. And over time, their nervous systems begin to view that state as normal. The body adapts to a lower CO wheel to a less efficient breathing pattern, and any attempts to breathe normally may initially create a feeling of discomfort. This is similar to how you have gotten used to living in a cold room, and when the temperature returns to normal, you feel hot instead. That adaptation does not mean the original state was optimal. It only means your system has adjusted to the current conditions. What makes this problem difficult to recognize is that many symptoms you attribute to psychological causes may actually begin from respiratory physiology. Feelings of anxiety, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, and even some forms of insomnia can be amplified. This does not mean that every psychological problem originates from breathing, but it does mean that breathing is an important variable in the system that is often overlooked. You may try to think positive or relax, but if you continue to maintain a breathing pattern that activates the sympathetic system, you are sending the opposite signal of what you are trying to achieve. And what is remarkable is that all of this can happen without your awareness. You do not need to decide to breathe fast. You only need to live in a state of stress long enough, and your system will automatically adjust in that direction. At some point, you no longer even remember what deep, slow, stable breathing feels like. It becomes something foreign. And when that happens, the stress, fast breathing anxiety loop is no longer just a temporary response. It becomes the foundation for your daily experience. If you look back at the entire chain we have gone through, from oxygen, ATP, sewing Karax, the respiratory center, to the autonomic nervous system, you will see that breathing is not just a simple action. It is a control knob located at the center of many different systems. And when that control knob is misaligned, the entire system shifts along with it. This leads to a question that you may have already started asking yourself. If the way you breathe can pull you into a prolonged state of stress, then can changing it pull you out of that state? If you are beginning to suspect that the problem is not only in moments of stress, but in a prolonged baseline state, then you are on the right track. Because what is happening is not a temporary glitch, but an accumulated deficit. A type of deficit that you do not see, cannot measure directly, but that shapes the way your entire system functions. Look at the context in which you are living. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, modern Americans spend more than 90% of their time indoors. That means most of your life takes place in a controlled environment, with limited space, little movement, and a very different type of physiological stimulation than what your body was designed to adapt to. You do not run, you do not climb, you do not breathe deeply in the natural way your body needs. You sit, you look at screens, you breathe, but in a very small, very shallow, almost minimal way. And over time, your system adapts to that. Not towards something better, but towards something more economical, more constricted. The rib cage expands less, the diaphragm is less active, and the ability to exchange gases decreases. This does not happen suddenly. It happens slowly, slowly enough that you do not notice. But its consequences accumulate. You begin to lose what you might call full respiratory capacity, not because your lungs are damaged, but because you are no longer using their full potential. And when that happens, another factor begins to change. Your ability to tolerate kun, or Kurzomers. As we have said, K is not just waste, it is a control signal. But if your body has become accustomed to maintaining low long levels due to fast and shallow breathing over a long period, then any slight increase in long can be perceived as a threat. You begin to overreact to very small changes. A small rise in Karakan is enough to trigger a feeling of discomfort, urging you to breathe faster and deeper in an inefficient way. This brings a cool red zing back down, but at the same time reinforces the loop we have been talking about. You become more sensitive to the very signals your body needs to regulate itself. And over time, your tolerance threshold decreases. This creates a state that I call They spread throughout the entire system. Chronically low CARC can alter the way oxygen is released into the tissues, affecting the Bohr effect and reducing the efficiency of oxygen use at the cellular level. That means that even if you have enough oxygen in your blood, you may still not be using it efficiently. This can contribute to the prolonged fatigue, lack of energy, and difficulty concentrating that many people experience without a clear cause. At the same time, your nervous system, which has become accustomed to a state of mild but continuous activation, begins to view that as normal. You live in a state of slight tension that you no longer even recognize, like background noise you've gotten used to. And when you try to relax, your body does not know how to return to that state naturally. It is like a system that has been thrown out of calibration. And what is remarkable is that all of this does not come from a single big event, but from very small changes repeated day after day. Less movement, shallower breathing, more time indoors. And over time, those changes accumulate into a state that you might call respiratory deficit, a state in which you still live, still function, but not at an optimal level. Once you begin to see that the problem is not just whether you breathe or not, but how you breathe, we need to talk about a detail that may seem small, but actually has a much greater impact than you think. Whether you are breathing through your nose or your mouth, you may think it does not matter. Air going into the lungs is still air, right? But no, your body is not designed to function that way. The nose is not just a hole for air to pass through. It is a sophisticated processing system, a biological filter, a regulator of pressure and temperature that you use every second without realizing it. When air passes through the nose, it is warmed to nearly body temperature, humidified to protect the lung mucosa, and filtered by nasal hairs and mucus that trap dust, bacteria, and small particles you do not want to bring deep inside. But that is only the surface. What is more important is the way the nose controls the flow of air. The nose creates a natural resistance, forcing air to enter more slowly, more evenly, and with more stable pressure. This helps distribute the air more deeply and uniformly in the lungs, optimizing the exchange of oxygen and CO oxygen and Ca at the alveoli. When you switch to mouth breathing, you bypass that entire system. Air enters faster, colder, drier, and unfiltered. This not only affects the lungs, but also changes the entire dynamics of breathing. You tend to breathe faster and shallower, and you lose the subtle control that the nose provides. This links directly to what we have said about Ca. When you breathe through your mouth, you easily fall into a state of mild, but prolonged hyperventilation, lowering CO-sync and activating the nervous system towards stress. But the impact of mouth breathing does not stop during the day. It becomes even clearer at night when you are no longer under conscious control. When you sleep, the position of the tongue and jaw plays an important role in keeping the airway open. Nose breathing helps maintain this structure stably. But when you breathe through your mouth, the jaw tends to drop open, the tongue falls backward, and the upper airway becomes more prone to collapse. This increases the risk of sleep disorders such as sleep apnea, where breathing is interrupted multiple times during the night. A 2015 study published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine confirmed the link between mouth breathing and this condition, showing that people who tend to breathe through their mouths have a higher risk of sleep problems and blood oxygenation issues during sleep. And what is this creates a loop that is hard to escape unless you change a fundamental factor. And that is the point I want you to really pay attention to. The way you breathe is no less important than the fact that you breathe. You may breathe enough times each day. You may have enough oxygen in terms of quantity. But if the way you bring air into your body is not aligned with the biological design of the system, you are still operating below optimal. This is not a small detail. It is a foundational variable. A small difference in the way you breathe can create a large difference in the way you sleep, the way you feel, and the way your nervous system functions. And when you connect this to the entire chain we have gone through, from oxygen, ATP, CO and quarch, the nervous system, stress, to breathing deficit, you begin to see that breathing is not a simple action. It is a multi-layered system, and every small choice within it, even whether you breathe through your nose or your mouth, can change the way the entire system operates. And if you think that nose breathing only stops at filtering and conditioning the air, there is still a deeper layer that most people have never heard of, and it completely changes the way you view this seemingly simple action. Inside your nasal sinuses, cells continuously produce a tiny gas molecule that plays an extremely important role: nitric oxide, or NO. This is not a minor detail, not an add-on feature you can ignore. In 1998, Robert Furchgott, along with Louis Ignoro and Farid Murad, were awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering that nitric oxide is a key biological signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. That means your body uses a type of gas, an extremely simple molecule, to transmit information between cells, especially to regulate the dilation of blood vessels. And what is interesting is that you are producing and using this molecule every time you breathe correctly without realizing it. When you breathe through your nose, nitric oxide produced in the nasal sinuses mixes with the airflow going down to the lungs. When you breathe through your mouth, this process is almost entirely bypassed, and that difference is not as small as you think. Nitric oxide has a vasodilating effect, meaning it helps blood vessels expand, reduces resistance, and allows blood to flow more easily. But in the lungs, its role is even more subtle. NO helps regulate the distribution of blood to areas of the lungs that have more oxygen to process, called ventilation-perfusion matching. This ensures that blood is delivered to the right places for the most efficient oxygen uptake. Without this mechanism, you could inhale the same amount of air, but the efficiency of gas exchange would be significantly lower. That means nitric oxide not only helps increase blood flow, but also helps optimize oxygen use at the microscopic level. And if you connect this to what we have said about ATP and the electron transport chain, you will see that any improvement in oxygen delivery to the cells has a direct impact on your ability to produce energy. Not in an abstract way, but in a very specific way. More oxygen used efficiently means more ATP is produced. But the story does not stop there. Nitric oxide also interacts with hemoglobin in the chemical environment in the blood, contributing to the regulation of how oxygen is released into the tissues. This is closely related to the Bohr effect we mentioned, where CO4, HOA, and pH influence hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. NO participates in that signaling network, helping ensure that oxygen is not only transported but also released in the right place at the right time. And if you stop and look at the entire system, you will see something very interesting. Your body does not rely on a single mechanism to manage oxygen. It uses multiple overlapping layers of. Here, breathing through the nose delivers NO directly into the lungs, where it performs a similar function but in a different part of the system. Two different pathways, the same molecule, the same principle, regulating flow and optimizing distribution. This shows that your body operates according to repeating principles rather than isolated mechanisms. And when you return to the simple act of breathing, you begin to see that when you choose to breathe through your mouth instead of your nose, you are not just changing the path of the air. You are removing an important signaling component from the process. You are reducing the ability to dilate blood vessels, reducing the efficiency of gas exchange, and indirectly reducing the efficiency of oxygen use at the cellular level. Once again, this is not a large difference that happens immediately. It is a small difference repeated thousands of times each day, but it is precisely that repetition that creates the real impact. And if you connect everything we have gone through from oxygen, ATP, Solwankankas, the nervous system, stress, to breathing deficit, and now nitric oxide, you begin to see a clearer, but also much deeper picture. Breathing is not just a basic biological action. It is a multi-layered control system where every detail, no matter how small, can change the way your entire body operates. And nitric oxide, a gas molecule you cannot even feel, turns out to be one of the silent but decisive factors in that system. You may think that when you sleep, your body shuts down and rests. But in reality, sleep is an extremely active process in which the nervous system, endocrine system, and cardiovascular system are reset. And all of those processes depend on one very basic thing: whether you are breathing correctly or not. One of the most common disorders related to this is sleep apnea, or obstructive sleep apnea, a condition in which breathing is repeatedly interrupted during the night. According to a study published in The Lancet in 2019, about 1 billion people worldwide may be affected by this condition, a number large enough for you to realize that this is not a rare or exceptional problem. When you experience apnea during sleep, what happens is not just that you stop breathing for a few seconds. Oxygen in the blood drops, CO2 rises, and your nervous system receives a signal that there is danger. Immediately, the sympathetic system is activated, heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, and your body is pulled out of deep rest, often during microarousals that you do not even remember. This can happen dozens or even hundreds of times each night. You do not realize it, but your system does, and the consequences are not just that you feel tired the next day. The repeated episodes of oxygen reduction and stress activation put pressure on the cardiovascular system, increasing the risk of hypertension, heart disease, and stroke over time. What makes this problem especially dangerous is that it is often not properly recognized. You may think you are sleeping enough hours, but the quality of your sleep is disrupted at a microscopic level. You do not achieve stable deep sleep and REM stages, where the body truly recovers and the brain processes information. And when this happens continuously, you begin to live in a state of chronic sleep deprivation without knowing it. This connects directly to what we have said about breathing. Your breathing pattern does not stop when you sleep. It continues, but no longer under conscious control. If you tend to breathe through your mouth, breathe shallowly, or have an airway structure that is prone to collapse, those problems will manifest more clearly when you sleep. The tongue falls back, the airway narrows, and each time you stop breathing, it depends on the way you breathe throughout that time. You can optimize everything else, from light, temperature, to pre-sleep habits, but if your breathing pattern is not appropriate, you are still overlooking a foundational factor. And what is remarkable is that this is not a rare problem, not a physiological exception. It is part of a broader trend in the way modern humans live and breathe. When you look back at the entire journey from the beginning to this point, you will see that breathing does not affect just one individual system. It runs through energy, nervous system, emotions, and sleep. And sleep, in a way, is where everything you do during the day is reflected most clearly. If your system is misaligned while you're awake, it will reveal itself when you sleep. When you begin to realize that sleep is not a separate event but part of a larger system, then you are getting closer to a much more important concept, circadian rhythm. This is your body's internal timing system, an approximately 24-hour cycle that controls almost everything from when you feel most alert during the day, when hormones are released, when body temperature rises or falls, to when you start feeling sleepy at night. The main control center of this system is located in the brain, in a small cluster of cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. But what is important is that it does not operate alone. It continuously receives signals from the environment and from your own body to adjust this rhythm to match reality. Light is the strongest signal, but not the only one. Your breathing, something you may never have thought about in this way, is also part of that system. When you change your breathing rhythm, you are not just changing cortisol levels or nervous system state at a single moment. You are influencing the way the central nervous system adjusts longer cycles. Respiration has a direct connection to the activity of the nervous system, especially the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic that we have discussed. And because this nervous system is closely linked to the endocrine system, where hormones are produced and released according to circadian rhythm, any change in breathing pattern can spread to the hormonal system. For example, cortisol, the hormone related to stress and alertness, has a very clear cycle. It rises high in the morning to help you wake up and gradually decreases in the evening. Melatonin, the hormone that controls sleep, works in the opposite direction. But if your nervous system is activated at the wrong time, if you breathe in a way that maintains a state of mild alertness throughout the day and night, you may disrupt these cycles. You may find yourself having trouble falling asleep at night or not feeling truly alert in the morning. And this is not random. It is the result of your internal timing system no longer being fully synchronized with the environment and with the internal signals of your own body. Breathing, in this context, becomes one of the signals you can control to influence circadian rhythm. When you breathe slowly and deeply in the evening, you are sending a signal to the nervous system that the body should shift into a rest state, supporting melatonin release and preparing for sleep. When you breathe faster or irregularly in the morning, you may be interfering with the natural signals the body uses to adjust alertness. This is especially important in the modern world, where artificial light, irregular work schedules, and lifestyle habits have weakened many natural signals that circadian rhythm relies on. Breathing, in this case, can become one of the few signals you can still actively adjust. And if you look back at the entire journey we have gone through, from oxygen, ATP, soul quench, the nervous system, stress, and sleep, you will see that breathing does not just affect individual parts, but also connects them together. Once you view breathing as part of the biological timing system, you will begin to see that it goes even deeper into an area that most people think is completely psychological: emotions. You may believe that your mood comes from your thoughts, from circumstances, from what happens in your life. That is not wrong, but it is not complete, because beneath what you feel, there is a very specific biological foundation operating, and breathing is one of the factors that directly impacts that foundation. The limbic system in the brain, which processes emotions, memories, and survival responses, does not operate independently of the body. It continuously receives signals from your physiological state, including heart rate, courage levels, and especially the way you breathe. When you change your breathing rhythm, you are changing the activity of the limbic system. Part of this mechanism involves serotonin, a neurotransmitter that plays an important role in regulating mood, feelings of happiness, and emotional stability. As we mentioned earlier, light and signals from the eyes can influence serotonin, but breathing also participates in this chain through the nervous system and pathways connected to the brainstem. When you breathe slowly and evenly, the parasympathetic system is activated, and this creates favorable conditions for a more stable emotional state. Conversely, when you breathe quickly and shallowly, especially in a state of stress, you activate the sympathetic system, increasing the activation of the limbic system and making you more prone to anxiety or overreacting to small stimuli. This is not a hypothesis. This is how the system is designed. And one of the clearest manifestations of this is a panic attack. Many people who experience panic attacks describe it as happening suddenly, as if there is no clear cause. But if you analyze it carefully, you will often see an initial small change in breathing rhythm. It may start with breathing a little faster, a little deeper, or irregularly. That reduces coelcanth, changes pH, activates the nervous system, and creates physical sensations such as a racing heart, dizziness, and shortness of breath. The brain then interprets these sensations as danger, and the emotional response is amplified. You begin to worry about those very sensations, and this makes you breathe even faster. The loop closes. What is important here is that a panic attack does not begin from a thought in the way you usually think. It begins from physiology, from breathing, and only then does it spread to emotions and perception. This does not make your emotions any less real. On the contrary, it shows that emotions have a clear physical foundation that can be measured and understood. When you feel anxious, it is not just an abstract state in your mind. It is the result of specific changes in the nervous system, in blood chemistry, in the way your body is breathing. And if you look in the opposite direction, this opens up an interesting possibility. If changes in breathing can trigger a negative emotional state, then changing breathing in the other direction can also reduce or adjust that state. Not by convincing yourself that you are calm, but by changing the physiological signals that the limbic system is receiving. This is a point that many modern treatment methods are beginning to pay attention to, from breathing therapy to neuromodulation techniques. But what is remarkable is that this mechanism has always been there, even when you did not know about it. Every breath you take sends a signal into your emotional system. And most of the time, you let that system run on its own, influenced by the environment, by stress, by habits. But once you realize that breathing is one of the most direct gateways to your emotional state, you begin to see that emotions are not just something that happens to you. They are something you can influence, not by thinking more, but by changing a basic biological process that has always been there from the beginning. And the immune system, a system you usually only think about when you are sick. And like everything else we have gone through, the immune system does not operate in a vacuum. It depends on energy, on neural signals, and especially on oxygen. White blood cells, the cells responsible for detecting and destroying pathogens, do not simply find and kill. They use oxygen in a process called the respiratory burst, where oxygen is converted into highly reactive molecules to destroy bacteria and viruses. This means oxygen is not just fuel for muscles or the brain, but also a direct weapon of the immune system. When you have enough oxygen, this system works efficiently. When you do not have enough, that ability declines. Hypoxia, or low oxygen, does not need to be at an extreme level, as you might think, to cause problems. Even mild but prolonged reductions in oxygen delivery to the tissues can affect immune function. Physiological studies have shown that hypoxia reduces the ability of white blood cells to migrate to sites of infection, reduces their ability to destroy pathogens, and alters the way the immune system responds to external agents. This does not mean you need obvious shortness of breath to have a problem. It can happen at a microscopic level, accumulating over time, especially if your breathing pattern does not optimize gas exchange. And if you connect this to what we have said before, you will see a clear chain of links. Fast and shallow breathing reduces coricory, affecting the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. Mouth breathing reduces nitric oxide and gas exchange efficiency. Sleep apnea interrupts oxygen supply during the night. All of these, in different ways, can lead to your cells receiving less oxygen than optimal. And the immune system is one of the first systems affected. This leads to a question you may have asked yourself without a clear answer. Why do you get sick more easily when you are tired, when you are stressed, when you sleep poorly? Part of the answer lies here. Stress and poor sleep affect breathing. Breathing affects oxygen. Oxygen affects the immune system. And the result is that your ability to fight infections decreases. Not because you are weak in a vague sense, but because a chain of specific biological processes has been shifted away from the optimal state. This also explains why recovery from illness depends not only on medication or nutrition, but also on your overall physiological state, including the way you breathe. When you breathe deeply and slowly, you improve oxygen distribution, reduce neural stress, and create favorable conditions for recovery processes to occur. When you breathe quickly, shallowly, and irregularly, you do the opposite. And what is remarkable is that most of the time, you are not even aware of this. You think the immune system is something automatic, operating independently of what you do, but in reality, it continuously responds to the state of your body. It does not depend only on your exposure to pathogens, but also on whether your body is in a state ready to deal with them. And breathing is one of the foundational factors that determine that state. When you look back at the entire picture, you begin to see that your ability to recover and your ability to resist illness do not lie only in what you put into your body, but also in the way you operate the system you already have. And in that system, breathing is not a small detail. It is one of the most basic levers you can influence. Every day, every minute, every second, to affect the way your body protects and repairs itself. There is another way to look at everything we have just discussed, not through energy, not through immunity, but through a system that you clearly feel every day, but rarely understand deeply. The cardiovascular system. Your heart is not simply a pump pushing blood throughout your body. It is part of There are small oscillations, and those very oscillations reflect the flexibility of the autonomic nervous system. High HRV is usually associated with better adaptability, better cardiovascular health, and better recovery from stress. Low HRV is usually associated with chronic stress, fatigue, and higher risk of heart disease. What is interesting is that HRV is not a fixed number. It changes from moment to moment, and one of the factors that has the most direct influence on it is the way you breathe. When you breathe slowly and deeply, especially when you lengthen the exhale. You activate the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic system. This makes your heart not beat in a rigid, uniform rhythm, but oscillate more flexibly according to the breathing cycle. When you inhale, heart rate increases slightly. When you exhale, heart rate decreases. This phenomenon is called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and it is a sign of a healthy and well-regulated cardiovascular system. When you breathe quickly and shallowly, this phenomenon diminishes. Heart rate becomes more rigid, less variable, and HRV decreases. This is not just a number on a measuring device. It reflects the state of the entire regulatory system inside your body. Research from the American Heart Association has confirmed that slow breathing techniques can increase HRV and simultaneously lower blood pressure, especially in people at cardiovascular risk. This does not happen in an indirect or psychological way. It is a clear physiological mechanism. When you breathe slowly, you reduce sympathetic activity, reduce vasoconstriction, and allow blood vessels to dilate. This reduces the pressure the heart has to work against to pump blood, thereby lowering blood pressure. At the same time, the increase in HRV shows that your nervous system is in a flexible state, able to switch between states efficiently instead of being stuck in a stress state. What is remarkable is that all of this happens just from changing the way you breathe. No medication needed. No complex equipment needed. Just changing the rhythm of a process you have performed tens of thousands of times each day. And if you connect this to what we have said about nitric oxide, you will see another layer of this system. Nose breathing not only improves gas exchange, but also delivers nitric oxide into the lungs, helping dilate blood vessels and improve blood flow. This combines with the effect of slow breathing on the nervous system to create a synergistic effect on the cardiovascular system. Blood vessels dilate, heart rate becomes more flexible, and pressure on the system decreases. This leads to an important realization. Your cardiovascular health does not depend only on what you eat or how much you exercise. It also depends on the way you breathe. Every minute, every hour, and most of the time you completely overlook this factor. You look for complex solutions to problems that part of which could be solved by returning to a basic function you have always had. When you look back at the entire journey from the beginning to this point, you will see that breathing does not affect just one individual system. It runs through energy, nervous system, emotions, immunity, and now the cardiovascular system. It is a point of intersection between many systems, a small lever that can create large changes if you know how to use it. The body does not stay in the same state forever. It changes, it adapts, and then gradually it declines. Aging is not an event that happens at a specific point in time, but a continuous process that occurs in every system, from the cardiovascular and nervous systems to the respiratory system. And if you look at breathing from this perspective, you will see something remarkable. Your respiratory system is also changing over time, in ways you may not notice until the consequences become obvious. This is not just an abstract number. It means that with each passing year, your ability to bring oxygen into the body and remove CO crack becomes slightly less efficient. At the same time, the elasticity of lung tissue decreases. The alveoli gradually lose their ability to expand and contract effectively, and the respiratory muscles also weaken. But there is another factor that is talked about less, and it relates directly to what we have discussed: the ability to tolerate coraca, or coraca tolerance. When you are young, your system is more flexible. It can handle changes in CO cornesaus without overreacting. But over time, especially if you maintain fast and shallow breathing for many years, your quiet tolerance threshold may decrease. This means your body reacts more strongly to small changes in corticors, triggering feelings of shortness of breath, anxiety, or instability more quickly. And this creates a familiar loop. Low corneum leads to faster breathing. Faster breathing reduces corneum even further, and the nervous system is pushed into a state of continuous activation. This does not only affect how you feel during the day, it spreads to sleep, where the system has already weakened with age. You may find yourself having more trouble falling asleep waking up more easily, and not feeling truly restored after a night's sleep. This is often accepted as a normal part of aging. But if you look deeper, you will see that part of this process is not inevitable. It is the result of the interaction between physiology and habits sustained over many years. And this is where the comparison with what we have seen in another context becomes clear. In the light scenario, the decline does not happen suddenly. It is the result of the absence of a small but continuous signal, an accumulated photon deficit over time. Here, you can think of something similar, an accumulated breathing deficit over many years of non-optimal breathing. It is not that you stop breathing. You still breathe every day. But the way you breathe no longer supports the system in the way it was originally designed. And that small misalignment, repeated millions of times, begins to create measurable changes in the body's function. The important thing is to recognize that aging is not just the decline of individual parts, but the decline of the entire system's ability to regulate itself. HRV decreases, CO and QA tolerance decreases, lung capacity decreases, and all of this makes the system less flexible and less adaptable. And when the system is less flexible, it is easier to push into a state of imbalance, even by small stimuli. This explains why the same level of stress that you could handle easily at age 30 becomes more difficult at age 60. Not because you are weaker in a simple sense, but because your regulatory system no longer operates with the same degree of flexibility. But this also leads to another important point. If part of this decline comes from the way the system has been used over time, then changing the way you use it, even at a later stage, can still make a difference. Breathing, once again, emerges as one of the most basic points of intervention, because it is not only a function affected by aging, but also a tool that can influence the way other systems operate in return. When you improve your breathing pattern, you do not just improve gas exchange. You affect the nervous system, HRV, Kamaquan regulation ability, and indirectly sleep quality and recovery capacity. And when you look back at the entire picture, you begin to see that aging is not an unchangeable straight line. It is a process with many intersection points, many places where small changes can accumulate into large differences over time. And breathing, simple but continuous, can be one of those points. Looking back at everything we have just gone through, from energy, nervous system, emotions, immunity, cardiovascular system to aging, you will begin to see something that is both simple and hard to accept. All of those systems depend on an action you have performed from the very first moment you entered this world. But no one ever taught you how to do it correctly. You took your first breath the moment you were born. No instructions needed, no thinking needed. It was instinct. And from then on you continued to breathe, every minute, every hour, every day. But here is what I find interesting. Just because a process is automatic does not mean it is happening in the optimal way. There is a very big difference between automatic and optimal. Automatic breathing is what keeps you alive. It ensures that you continuously exchange oxygen and CO. Tipillates continuously exchange oxygen and coring. But optimal breathing is what determines how you live during that time. It determines your energy level, your nervous system state, your sleep quality, and your recovery ability. And most people never move from the automatic level to the optimal level because they have no idea that such a difference even exists. This is not your fault. It is the result of the way modern society is designed. You live indoors more than 90% of the time, with little movement, constant exposure to stress, and often in a state of mild nervous system activation. All of that quietly changes the way you breathe. You start breathing more shallowly, more quickly, and more often through the mouth. And because this process happens gradually, you do not realize that you have moved away from the way this system was designed to function. There was never a single moment when you learned to breathe wrong. You simply gradually adapted to your environment, and that adaptation is not always optimal for long-term health. What is interesting is that if you observe a young child, you will see a completely different breathing pattern. The belly moves rhythmically, the breath is deep, slow, and even. The system operates smoothly, without conscious intervention, but very efficiently. Over time, that breathing pattern changes. Not because your body forgets how to breathe, but because you begin to operate in an environment and at a pace of life that no longer sustains that pattern. And then you consider that new state normal. This is the point where I want you to pause for a moment and think. How many things in your life do you consider normal simply because you have gotten used to them, not because they are the optimal state? Your breathing may be one of them. You do not question it because it has always been there. But precisely because it has always been there, it has the ability to affect everything else without being noticed. And this leads to an interesting paradox. One of the most powerful tools you have to influence the state of your body and mind is something you completely overlook because it is so familiar. You look for solutions outside in medication, in technology, and complex methods, while part of the answer may lie right in the way you inhale and exhale every day. This does not mean breathing is the solution to everything, but it does mean you have overlooked a fundamental variable in your own system. And once you start paying attention to it, you begin to realize that many states you thought were natural or unchangeable can actually be influenced, at least in part, by adjusting the way you breathe. And when you look back at the entire journey from the beginning to this point, you will see a continuous thread from an oxygen molecule entering the body, to ATP, to caloric impacts, to the nervous system, to emotions, to sleep, to immunity, to aging. All of it starts from an action you were never taught, but that you perform continuously. And the question is no longer whether you are breathing or not. The question is whether you are breathing in the way your system was designed to function, or whether you are simply maintaining life without taking full advantage of what that process can provide. If you accept that breathing is a forgotten instinct, then the next step is no longer comfortable because it forces you to face an uncomfortable possibility. The same process that is keeping you alive may also, over time, contribute to the decline of your system. Breathing is not always good by default. It is a tool, and like any tool, the way you use it determines the outcome. It can heal or it can cause harm, not in a dramatic sense, but in an accumulated, slow, almost imperceptible way in each moment, but clear when you look back over many years. You have seen this repeated through each section. Fast breathing reduces CO, Huenio, changes pH, activates the nervous system. Mouth breathing loses nitric oxide, reduces gas exchange efficiency. Unstable breathing patterns reduce HRV, increase blood pressure. Respiratory disorders during sleep interrupt oxygen supply and put pressure on the cardiovascular system. None of these factors, by itself, is enough to cause a major problem immediately, but they do not exist in isolation. They combine, layer on top of each other, and repeat every day. And over time, they can contribute to what you call chronic disease, not as the sole cause, but as part of the causal system that you rarely consider. This leads to a form of conflict you may not recognize. You're using a vital life process in a way that may reduce the quality of that very life. And what makes this conflict special is that you do not feel it clearly. You do not have a strong warning signal saying you are breathing wrong. Instead, you have vague signs: fatigue, mild anxiety, poor sleep, difficulty concentrating, a prolonged feeling of tension. You attribute those signs to work, to age, to circumstances. While part of the story may lie in a much more fundamental place, and this is the point where I want you to truly pause, not to accept a conclusion, but to ask a question. Are you breathing correctly? Not whether you are breathing or not. That is obvious. The question is whether the way you are breathing is appropriate for the way your system was designed to function. Are you breathing slowly or quickly? Through the nose or through the mouth? Deeply or shallowly? Steadily or intermittently? And do you realize that those choices, whether you are conscious of them or not, are being made tens of thousands of times each day? This is not a theoretical question. It is a practical question, because your answer does not just reflect a habit. It reflects the state of your entire system. And if you look back at everything we have gone through, you will see that breathing is not a peripheral factor. It lies at the center of many processes you care about, from energy, emotions, sleep, to long-term health. That makes this conflict clearer. You have a powerful tool, always available, but you may be using it in a way that does not support you. And because it is automatic, you can continue doing that for many years without ever stopping to check. But once you start asking the question, once you start observing, you cannot go back to the state of not knowing. You begin to notice details you previously overlooked. You begin to see that your breathing changes according to your state, and your state also changes according to your breathing. And that opens up a possibility, but also a responsibility. If breathing can contribute to the problem, then it can also be part of the solution. But to get there, you must face this conflict first. You must acknowledge that something you have always considered good enough may actually be only good enough to survive, not optimal to live. If breathing can help or harm, then what is the right amount? And what amount begins to become a problem? In other words, what is the dosage? In physiology, there is a principle that repeats in almost every system. Dose matters, dosage determines the effect. Too little is not enough to create an impact. Too much creates imbalance. Breathing is no exception. Studies on neuromodulation and cardiovascular function have shown that a breathing rate of about 5 to 6 breaths per minute, equivalent to about 10 to 12 seconds for each inhale-exhale cycle, tends to optimize many physiological markers at once. At this rate, you see a clear increase in heart rate variability, stronger synchronization between heart rate and breathing, and effective activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is not a random number. It reflects the frequency at which your cardiovascular and respiratory systems interact with each other in resonance, where the body's natural oscillations are amplified rather than canceled out. But the important thing is not that you have to hit one specific number. The important thing is to understand that there is an optimal zone, a range in which the system operates most efficiently. When you breathe too fast, which many people do without realizing, you move out of that zone. When Cooch drops, pH rises, blood vessels constrict, and the nervous system shifts into an activated state. You may feel more alert in the short term, but in the long term, you are maintaining a state that the body must constantly compensate for. Conversely, if you deliberately breathe too slowly, beyond your body's ability to adapt, you can also cause imbalance. Feelings of discomfort, air hunger, or even dizziness may appear if the system is not yet accustomed to that level. This shows that breathing is not a simple on-off switch, but a continuous variable that needs to be adjusted within an appropriate range. And this is the point that many people often overlook when they try to optimize their breathing. They move from a state of inattention to one of over-intervention, trying to control every breath, every second, without understanding that this system works best when guided gently, without being forced. Dosage here is not only the number of breaths per minute, it also includes depth, regularity, and appropriateness to the body's state at that moment. A slow and deep breathing rhythm may be appropriate when you need to relax, but it is not necessarily optimal when you are exercising or need to react quickly. This goes back to the original principle. Your system was designed for flexibility, not to be locked into a rigid pattern, and breathing, when adjusted correctly, can support that flexibility. When you look back at everything we have gone through, you will see that many problems arise when the system is pushed out of the optimal zone for too long in either direction. Breathing too fast, too shallow, too irregularly, all are forms of deviation from that zone. And because breathing happens continuously, that small deviation can accumulate into large effects. This leads to a different way of looking at breathing, not as a single action, but as a form of dose that you are providing to your body every day. Each breath is a small unit, and the total of tens of thousands of those units creates your physiological state. When you understand this, you begin to see that adjusting breathing is not something done once, but a matter of changing the way you dose it over time. No need for extremes, no need for perfection, just staying close enough to the optimal zone so the system can function the way it was designed. And that is where small changes, if sustained, can create differences you may not notice immediately, but will feel when you look back. You inhale a breath, Oxygen enters the lungs, diffuses across the alveolar membrane, binds to hemoglobin, and is carried throughout the body. At the cellular level, oxygen enters the mitochondrion, participates in the electron transport chain, allowing the production of ATP, the form of energy that every biological process depends on. Without oxygen, there is no ATP. Without ATP, there is no activity. That places breathing at the center of the energy system. But the story does not stop there. When you change your breathing rhythm, you change the level of CO in the blood, change the pH, and immediately affect the nervous system. The sympathetic and parasympathetic systems adjust your state from stress to relaxation, from alertness to recovery. Fast breathing pushes you into an activated state. Slow breathing pulls you back into a stable state. That places breathing at the center of the nervous system. Next, the cardiovascular system. Your heart rate does not operate independently. It synchronizes with breathing through respiratory sinus arrhythmia. When you breathe slowly, HRV increases, blood vessels dilate, and blood pressure drops. Nitric oxide from the nose and from other mechanisms supports vasodilation and improves circulation. That places breathing at the center of the cardiovascular system. And then comes the immune system. White blood cells need oxygen to perform the respiratory burst, to destroy pathogens. Hypoxia impairs that ability. Your breathing pattern affects oxygen delivery, the baseline stress level of the nervous system, and therefore affects the ability to fight infection and recover from illness. That places breathing at the center of the immune system. You begin to see a repeating pattern. Every system you care about, everything you think is important, has a path that leads back to the same point. And that point is not a specific organ, not a type of medication, not a technology. It is a process that you perform continuously, frequently, and almost completely unconsciously. What makes this remarkable is not the existence of these connections. Physiology has described them for a long time. What is remarkable is that you can live your entire life without ever seeing them as a unified system. You think about energy separately, about stress separately, about sleep separately, about illness separately. You look for solutions to each individual problem. But if all of those systems receive signals from the same source, then ignoring that source means you are overlooking an important part of the picture. This does not mean that breathing is the sole cause of everything. That would be an oversimplification. But it does mean that breathing is a point of convergence, a place where many systems intersect, and therefore a place where small changes can spread in many directions. When you improve the way you breathe, you are not just affecting one variable. You are adjusting a central knob in the network. And because this network operates in a non-linear way, those changes can amplify over time. This also explains why small interventions in breathing, such as breathing more slowly, breathing through the nose, or increasing awareness of breathing rhythm, can produce effects that initially seem disproportionate to their simplicity. You are not adding anything new to the system. You are simply adjusting the way an existing process operates. And because that process lies at the center, the effects spread in many directions. When you look back at the entire journey, you can see a very clear thread from an oxygen molecule to energy to the nervous system to the cardiovascular system to immunity to emotions to sleep to aging. All of it is connected, and all of it in one way or another depends on breathing. This leads to a different way of looking at health, not as a collection of separate systems that need to be fixed one by one, but as a network that needs to be adjusted at strategic points, and breathing is one of those points. Not the only one, but one of the most accessible, the most continuous, and the most overlooked. And once you see this, you cannot go back to the old way of seeing things. You begin to see that every breath is not just a basic biological action. It is a signal, an input, a part of the control system running in your body. And the question is no longer whether that system is working or not. It is always working. The question is whether you are providing it with the conditions to operate optimally. One breath, not an abstract concept, not a technique, but the very breath you just took a few seconds ago, the breath that is entering your body right now. Air passes through the nose, through the trachea, branches into hundreds of millions of alveoli. Oxygen diffuses into the blood, binds to hemoglobin, moves to every cell, enters the mitochondrion, participates in the chain of reactions that produce ATP. Everything we have talked about, the entire energy system, nervous system, cardiovascular system, immune system, all of it begins from that event. And what is remarkable is not the complexity of this process. Science has described it in great detail. What is remarkable is that you have performed that process millions of times in your life without ever stopping to truly look at it. You have breathed about 20,000 times each day. Multiply that by the number of days you have lived, and the number becomes enormous. And in all those times, how many times have you truly paid attention to the way you are breathing? Not just realizing that you are breathing, but actually observing it, understanding it, recognizing that each breath is a chain of tightly linked physical and biological events. Most of the time, the answer is not many, and that is not a personal failing. It is the way the system is designed. Breathing has to be automatic because you cannot devote your entire attention to it. But precisely because it is automatic, it becomes invisible. And when something becomes invisible, you rarely question it. You accept it as a given. But now, after everything you have seen, you are no longer in the same position. Breathing is no longer a background action you overlook. It is a process you know is connected to the energy you have, the state you feel, the way you sleep, the way your heart beats, the way your immune system responds. And that changes the way you look at it, even if you have not yet changed anything in the way you perform it. This is an important point, because understanding comes before change. You cannot adjust a system you do not recognize, and now you have recognized it. You know there is a difference between breathing fast and breathing slowly, between breathing through the nose and through the mouth, between breathing shallowly and breathing deeply. You know that those differences do not only affect immediate sensations, but also accumulate over time. And this leads to a realization you may not like, but one that is hard to avoid. You have been using an extremely powerful tool throughout your life without ever being guided on how to use it optimally. That does not make what you have done wrong. It only means there is a level of understanding you have never accessed. And once you access it, you cannot return to the previous state. You begin to notice small changes. You may recognize when you are breathing faster than usual. You may sense when you switch to mouth breathing. You may see the connection between the way you breathe and the way you feel. And this does not happen suddenly. It is a gradual process of awareness, like learning to see a detail you previously overlooked. And the more you look, the clearer it becomes. This does not require you to change immediately. It does not require you to do everything right from now on. It only requires you to start paying attention, because attention is the first step toward adjustment. And when you start paying attention to your breathing, you are doing something very specific. You are bringing an unconscious process into the realm of awareness. You are shining light on a part of the system that previously operated in the dark, and that alone already changes the way the system operates, not because you force it to change, but because you begin to interact with it. When you look back at the first breath we talked about, you can see that it is not just a biological event. It is the starting point of a sequence you have repeated countless times. And each repetition is an opportunity, not a big opportunity, not a decisive moment, but a small, repeated opportunity to adjust the system in the direction you want. And what makes this special is that you do not need to create that opportunity. It has always been there. You only need to recognize it. And once you realize that every breath is a point of intervention, a point where you can influence the way your system operates, you begin to see that changes do not need to come from big things. They can start from something very small, very basic, very familiar, but never truly understood. And that is where the entire story returns, not to end, but to open a new way of seeing an action you have performed since before you can remember. At this point, if you are waiting for a clear conclusion, a definitive answer that this is the correct way you must breathe from now on for the rest of your life, then perhaps this story is going in a different direction. Not because of a lack of data, not because science is not strong enough, and certainly not because the human body is some mysterious thing that cannot be understood. On the contrary, science has given us an increasingly detailed picture of what is happening. We know where oxygen goes. We know what carbon dioxide does. We know how the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata responds, how the vagus nerve affects heart rate, how nitric oxide dilates blood vessels, how breathing patterns can influence sleep, mood, blood pressure, immunity, and even the way the body ages. We know a great deal, but knowing the mechanism is not the same as living inside that mechanism. Science can describe the system. It can measure it, chart it, write equations for it, attach sensors to it, track it in the laboratory. But there is one thing science cannot do for you. It cannot breathe for you. It cannot feel the sensation when your chest tightens from anxiety, when your breath shortens from stress, when you lie in bed unable to sleep deeply. When a slow, long breath calms your entire body in a way that almost needs no explanation. That is the part that charts cannot reach, and that does not make science weaker. It only reminds you that science is the map, not the territory. It gives you the mechanism, does not replace the experience. It tells you what is likely happening, but you are the one who must turn inward and see whether it is true for your own body. That is why I do not want to end with a command. I do not want to tell you that you just need to breathe according to some formula and everything will be fixed. The body is not that simple. Life does not operate like a toaster, where you just select the right setting and everything is fine. The body is an adaptive, living system, always responding, always changing according to context. A breathing pattern that helps you calm down while sitting still may not be the right pattern while you are running. An ideal rate on paper may not be something your body accepts immediately if it has lived for many years in a state of stress. This means there is no absolute conclusion, because breathing does not exist separately from the rest of your life. It reflects how you are living and at the same time contributes to the way you are living. And perhaps that is the most important thing we have arrived at. Breathing is not a faint background detail. It is not just what keeps you from dying. It is part of the ongoing dialogue between the body and the world, between physiology and emotion, between the automatic and what can be consciously intervened in. You have performed this action millions of times, tens of thousands of times each day, for many years, perhaps for most of your life without ever questioning it. And that is completely understandable, because things that repeat continuously often become invisible. You do not think about gravity every time you take a step. You do not think about electricity every time you turn on a light. And you do not think about breathing every time you live one more minute. But now, after everything you have seen, perhaps you cannot fully return to the old state anymore. Perhaps now, breathing is no longer an anonymous background movement. Perhaps it has become something with clearer shape in your mind, something with mechanism, with consequences, with power. Not in a mystical way, not in a magical way, but in a very physical, very biological, very real way. One breath may not change your entire life, but thousands of breaths, performed in a different way, in a different state of attention, can change the trajectory of the entire system. I am not saying that as a promise. I am saying it as a possibility. And perhaps science at its best always does that. It does not force you to believe, does not make you submit, but opens up a possibility and invites you to test it in reality. That is why the story does not really end here, because the rest no longer lies in my words. It lies in the next moment when you pause, even for a few seconds, and realize you are inhaling, not a notion of breathing, not a theory, but actual breathing, passing through your nose, entering your lungs, changing your blood, affecting your brain, regulating your heart, and quietly participating in every system we have just gone through. Science can bring you to the edge of understanding, but from there onward you must continue on your own with your own observation. And therefore, instead of closing with a firm conclusion, perhaps the most honest way to leave the story is to leave you with a question that does not require you to answer immediately. but may follow you into the very next breath. Are you breathing, or are you understanding what you are doing? If you feel this perspective changes the way you understand your body, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories. I will see you in the next part, where we continue to look deeper into the things that seem most familiar.